Today's guest is the absolutely lovely Ian White, the founder of the Australian Bushflower Essences. Now, for those of you who are in my Homeopathy Hangout Facebook group, you'll know that I had a little gremlin in my computer just before Christmas. I thought I was being very smart and I'd recorded 2 months ahead of episodes. And then just before Christmas, I lost 10 of my interviews and Ian was one of them. So, oh my gosh, it was not fun just after Christmas having to email this wonderful man who I had the most amazing episode with and say, Ian, I'm so sorry, I've lost your interview. Can we re-record? And Ian was so gracious to agree. So Ian, if you're listening, thank you so much with all my heart. I really appreciate it. Now, this is such a special episode because it's all about the Australian bushflower essences. And I've known about them in the past. I used to work in a health shop where we sold them, but I didn't quite get them until my first interview with Ian last year. And holy moly, I can really see the potential for these remedies. They're so easy to use. There's no aggravations, very gentle, but still very profound. If you go to their website, ausflowers.com.au, that's AUSFLOWERS.com.au, you can pop on their website there and see all the amazing remedies they have, or their essences. There's combinations, there's roll-ons, there's oral sprays, there's mists, they've got skincare, they've got pendants. The pendants sound amazing. Actually, Ian showed me one during the interview. I'm also going to upload this video onto Rumble. So if you want to see the video interview, hop onto Rumble and have a look. As you may know, YouTube has actually suspended my account for 3 months because we had 2 interviews, one with Leah Golden and one with Jeremy Sher, where we spoke about how homeopathic remedies can help with vaccine reactions. And YouTube decided that was medical misinformation, so they suspended my account. So hop onto Rumble, type in Eugenie Kruger homeopathy, and my interview with Ian White will pop up there. So do have a look. Definitely pop onto the ausflowers.com.au website if you want to find out more about Ian's courses. Some coming up very soon, face-to-face over in Sydney. And that sounds amazing. We talk about it right at the end of the interview as well. But just hop on the ausflowers.com.au website, click on education, and you'll see the online workshops, face-to-face correspondence, their international course calendar. So yeah, pop on there if you want to learn more about these incredible essences and how you can use them in the home and also in your clinic. I hope you enjoy the episode. If you want to continue the conversation, hop onto the Homeopathy Hangout Facebook group and flick me an email at info@eugeniekruger.com if you have any questions, and check the show notes if you want to know more about how you can get hold of the Australian bushflower essences, or hop on their website. Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome to the Homeopathy Hangout, where we discuss all things homeopathy from around the world. And now my mum and your host, Eugenie Kruger.
Hello, homies, and a very warm welcome to Homeopathy Hangouts. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with the absolutely lovely Ian White, who is the founder of the Australian Bushflower Essences. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Hi there, Eugenie. And everyone listening too.
Yeah, I am so excited to have you on, Ian. Now, my experience with the Australian Bushflower Essences was when I used to work in a health shop, and I saw these beautiful products there and I was so intrigued, and there were loads of testers. So I would go and smell all of them. And then I got hooked on your moisturizer range. It was just so good for my skin. The fragrances were amazing. It was like this incredible experience of just smelling the products, but then also so nice for my skin. And then one of the staff told me, hey, they've got this space clearing essence. So whenever we had like bad vibes in the shop, people coming in, we would like use the space clearing essence to just clear the space. And it really, really worked. So I just want to say I've loved your products for several years now, and I love what they're doing. But can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you first got into the natural health journey? Because it's something that's in your family, but share that beautiful story with us of how you were first introduced to natural medicine.
I grew up in Sydney, just about 45 minutes northwest of the CBD, and my parents' property backed onto Kringai Chase National Park. So the bush was my playground as a child. And living next door to us, but so you had to climb down the cliff or an old get to a dirt road, was my grandmother. And my grandmother was a herbalist. She, along with my great-grandmother, was some of the first white people to look at medicinal properties of Australian plants. And my great-great-grandmother had come across from Europe to work as a herbalist on the gold fields in the 1850s. And we joked that my dad's the black sheep of the family because he was a pharmacist, but he still worked with herbs. He was like a suburban Newton pharmacy, for those who maybe in New South Wales know of Newton's pharmacy in the city. And I really loved spending time with my grandmother. I'd go bushwalking with her. I'd help her make up all the herbal extracts and fluid tinctures. And because she'd been working with so many of the plants, when we walk, she'd point out the plants, talking about their healing qualities. So from a young age, I got an appreciation. Out in the bush, there are all these very powerful healing plants. Unfortunately, my grandmother was riddled with cancer the day I was born. She was a very heavy smoker. She kept it at bay with phytolacca and sorrel, and then 3 Australian plants. And then she went traveling off to Europe and got separated from her luggage. And the stress of traveling, by the time my dad got all the herbs that she needed to her, she was very ill, flown back, went into a coma. And all that knowledge was lost for a second time. Indigenous people with smallpox and what have you, that oral tradition was lost as well. And I went off to university, was doing a science degree, got very sick traveling in India. So started working with herbs to rebuild my health, got involved in yoga and meditation. And then just in my last year, I realized the thing that I was really interested in were more the natural therapy. So then I went and it was the only full-time naturopathic course in New South Wales. And this was in the late 70s. And I probably graduated more as a homeopath than a herbalist and went into practice. And I've been practicing for 45 years. And the bush essences came a number of years after that.
Mm. Yeah. Well, you're doing something right, because when I look at you, I'm just like, you do not look like you could be practicing 45 years. You don't look more than 45 yourself. So I don't know if you're including that from when you were a baby, when you say 45 years, but yeah, whatever you're doing, it's working.
Yeah. That's the secret bush essences we'll reveal at the end of the interview. Yeah.
And also I heard this story about you feigning illness when you were a little boy so you could spend time with your grandma.
Oh, I should have been an actor. Like, my dad was harder to please, but my mum was a bookkeeper, and when I'd wait for my dad to leave, then I'd go to my mum and I'd be doubled up with pain, pleading I wanted to go to school. And she said, "Oh no, you're far too sick. You better spend the day with your grandmother." And as soon as I worked out my mum had gone off to work, I would recover, and it was much more fun going out in the bush with my grandmother and making all the herbs, etc., than going to school. And my mum had come back at the end of the day to pick me up and say, "Oh, how was Ian?" And my grandmother, I think she enjoyed my company. She said, "Oh, he gradually got a little bit better." So the downside was my mum was convinced I had some benign growth in my stomach. So she took me off to every gastrointestinal specialist in Macquarie Street here in Sydney, and everyone would give me barium meals and x-ray. So it was a wonder my digestive system actually functions at all. And I confessed to my mum a few years before she died, and she was in her 80s. I never really had problems. I just wanted to be in the bush, and she was quite mortified. She thought she was a bad mother for her son being so sick all the time.
Oh, I'm sure that your grandma's with you every single day and so loving the work that you're doing with the flower essences. So tell us a bit, Ian, how did the Australian bush flower essences come about? How were you first inspired to create these? What was the process that led to that?
Well, I really enjoyed the concept of the flower essences when I was studying my naturopathy. And at that time, the only ones available were the bark flowers. And I thought, well, why isn't someone doing any research with Australian plants, having spent all that time with my grandmother, knowing that in the bush there are all these very powerful plants? And no one had been doing that research. So I used to run courses in naturopathy and bark flowers and homeopathic first aid, and I'd be using the bark flowers in my practice. But quite often I'd be disappointed because I knew I'd had the right remedy, but people couldn't tell if there was anything change or things weren't happening. And then a good friend of mine who I'd shared a house with when I was doing my naturopathy, and he, early 30s, charismatic, successful young man, brought up an organic farm. He was told me he'd been diagnosed with bowel cancer. So he wanted, because of my interest in meditation, if I'd run a healing circle the night before they're going to operate on him. So all our mutual friends were equally shocked as I was. So they all came and we did a healing circle. There was meditation, directing energy. And then they operated the next day on Jim. It spread everywhere, and they said there's nothing they can do for him. So I continued that healing circle weekly in my home. And we opened it up to anyone who needed healing. And shortly, he died about 6 months later. And shortly after his death, in the meditations of the healing circle, I started getting pictures of plants told where to go and find them and what their healing qualities were. And I'm more of an auditory person, so to have very strong visuals was very exciting. And sometimes if I didn't know the plant, there'd be a little caption underneath the flower with the botanic name. So it was like being presented on a platter to me, and I'd go and do research. And I can remember making some of the flowers, being told where to go and make them. I thought, oh, I know that area. There's no flannel flowers growing down. I'd go there and just be a mass of flannel flowers. So for 2 years, I was just out in the bush every day. I was already established in my practice. I was using the remedies on patients and getting great results. I was giving them to people I knew, colleagues, doctors, homeopaths, naturopaths, to use, see if they could get the results that I was getting. And there'd be synchronicity, such as if I made a remedy that day, patients I might be seeing later that afternoon all needed that remedy. So it gave me the sense, oh, I'm on the right track. But also I could observe, well, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? And so for 2 years, I just did this lot of research. I thought at that point it'd just be for Australian people given their Australian flowers, and I started publishing the information. And it didn't take long before we had people in other countries wanting to bring them into Europe, North, South America, and the results they were getting were equally as well. And I realized, well, we're very much a global village, that something that's growing in Australia can have an equally important impact on someone living in another country.
That's amazing. And what was your first flower that you made?
Bush iris, which Pattersonia longifolia. It's a lovely flower. Doesn't last very long. Like if you pick it, it'll die straight away. Only lasts 1 day. So on one level, it's people very uncomfortable about death, whether it's their own or people around them. It's also working powerfully on the lymphatic system, and it's working on the pineal. So we have it in our travel essence because the pineal is regulating body clock. So if you're flying to a different time zone, to help you readjust very quickly. But on that spiritual level, it's going much deeper into any religious or spiritual practice, meditations, etc. So I thought it was a nice one, being the very first one that allowed me to go deeper into exploring the essences.
I was about to say that it's probably not coincident that your first remedy that you're getting is a remedy that has an action on the pineal to help you better understand and get in touch with other essences. How did this remedy come to you? Was this the one in the meditation that this was the first?
Most of them were in meditations, and occasionally I'd get some in dreams. For example, the boab, which is such a fantastic tree growing in your state in Western Australia, up in the Kimberley area. And with that one, it was a very clear message that there was this white candle-like flower. And like, I think I was in the post office up in Darwin, and they had it wasn't the boab, it was the bottle tree, but there was some flowers on the ground had sort of destroyed. They were too old. And I was thinking, walking around, thinking, I'd love to see, sorry, it was a boab. I'd love to see what this flower looks like. And then a flower fell directly, a full flower, and like there was no flowers on that tree. So I was teaching in Darwin and organised, the workshop coordinator and I and a friend of mine, we headed off driving into the Kimberleys from Darwin. And this was late in the season. This was April. Usually the flowering time's right now. We didn't find any, but it was certainly started the adventure, and then the following year went back to the Kimberleys to make it. And that's the beauty of making the essences in Australia. 1 year, my wife and I, we travelled 5 hours across to Perth, waited in transit for a couple of hours, 3-hour flight to Broome, 2-hour drive, and the boabs were very late that year. So I was like, okay, go all the way back. And because I make a number of remedies up in the Kimberleys, but like most of them are around the August, September flowering time. So boab's the only one just to travel all that way just to make it.
Oh, my goodness. The
last time I made it was 37 degrees that day I made it, but it's a spectacular one. And I think for all the homeopaths, it's very special, not as a flower essence, because it has that homeopathic aspect of working on the miasms as well. And you also get Herring's law coming through where, there are from the top and above, and the sequence where you've got the illnesses coming back out. So it's a really beautiful essence.
It's interesting because actually just Camilla Scher, you've just already had a Facebook post come up yesterday about the boab tree, and in South Africa, where I'm originally from, grows over there as well. Do you think that your training as a homeopath as well has influenced how you ended up making the remedies? It would be interesting to know if you had just studied, say, herbal medicine, if you would have gone more for like a tincture then as opposed to the essences. Like, can you maybe talk to us a little bit about your decision on how to make the remedies the way that you do? And you call them, do you call them essences or remedies, or just for people that are
Our
completely,
essences generally
yeah.
as
And
a modality, yeah.
and how do you prepare them? Kind of what potency are they? So for somebody that has no idea about this and they know that this is a homeopathy podcast, talk to me a little bit about how they are made and what sort of
Yeah.
mode of action they would have.
So I would start by saying you've got that umbrella of vibrational therapies, and homeopathy is in there, flower essences there, gem elixirs. They are all that vibrational, and they're quite distinct but come under that category. And the earliest records of the flower essences goes back to Egyptian times. They found records on papyrus going back 3,000 years of collecting the dew of flowers that treat emotional imbalances. The earliest recorded European use is Hildegard von Bingen, who I'm sure many of your listeners will know of her music, and she's a Catholic saint in the last decade or so. And she was born 1098, and she ended up becoming a abbess running the monastery for all the nuns, and she'd get the nuns to lay muslin sheets out overnight on the flowers. They'd collect it in the morning after it's absorbed the dew of the flowers. They'd wring it out and they would give it orally to treat emotional imbalances. And if someone was physically quite ill, they do hydrotherapy, wrapping the sheets around them. So then you had Paracelsus in the 16th century, who was also collecting the dew of plants to treat emotional imbalances. And then if we look at indigenous use, the Aboriginal people here in Australia, a common thing would be to eat the flowers, knowing you're getting medicinal properties as well, and emotional healing ones, as well as nutrition. And something like the Banksias, if you live in Australia, no matter what state, you've got Banksias growing. In the centre, it's very hard. So they would sit people amongst the Banksia tree to absorb the vibration. And interesting, we call it old man Banksia, the essence that I work with. And yet for the Aborigines, a tree for female spirituality. And interesting that it works on thyroid, amongst other things. And there's a metaphysical system called the elements of man, where you can be an earth, air, fire, water, and it's not based on your birth date. And there are more women who are water element. And each element has a key endocrine gland, and the key endocrine gland for the waters is the thyroid, which means it's more likely that gland to go out of balance than the others. And conversely, if you balance it, it can bring up some of the others which aren't functioning so well. So it's a very key one. So again, the indigenous people having that sense of what the old man Banksia. So when, Joseph Banks came, collected it, took all the samples back to Kew Gardens, he came with James Cook in 1770. It's got a very gnarled old bark, very slow growing, and they called it old man. But if it had tapped into Aboriginal wisdom, it would have been old woman Banksia. So we did an international flower essence conference, the third international one here in Sydney in 1992. And we had two Aboriginal elders open up. And one was from Western Australia. And he was treated for polio successfully by the tribe. So they dug a hole, put burning coals down, put bark of a tree over the coals, wrapped him in kangaroo fur, put him in there, filled in the sand, but also put in specific flowers to work with the polio, and then poured water down, which would seep and create the steam that he was wrapped in. And for any severe, we'd call it psychotic episode, or very severe physical problem, they would do that treatment. So we know when the first fleet arrived in 88 in Sydney, in their diaries, when the Aborigines were sick, they would float flowers in water and then drink the water. So there's a very long traditional use and indigenous cultures throughout the world. But then we had Edward Bach, who was also a very well-known homeopath. The bowel nosodes were his invention. And he was influenced by a number of other homeopaths. Some used to walk around with glass bell jars on. They'd put flowers in and keep the sun shining on and in water there to make remedies. So he's very excited by that. And now for Bach, when he started doing his research, he made his remedies in two ways. Like there were a lot of buds of trees, chestnuts, for example. So he would boil them. Or the flowers, he would simulate that one of what nature's doing by producing the dew, by picking the flowers, floating in a bowl of water, and the sun would release that vibrational quality into the water. And now that's called the sunshine method. So as I said, like 47 degrees heat, when you're making boab essence, you don't need to boil. You're literally boiling anyway. So I've just used the sunshine method back in appreciation, acknowledgement of the great work Bach did to bring forward this ancient healing art. Because a lot of the indigenous knowledge, its histories in Japan, in India, Brazil, here in Australia, a lot of that knowledge has been lost. And he really brought forward that concept. Now, if you're a homeopath, each dilution down you're succussing, and you can get up to your 10 M's and past. Whereas with the flower essences, that bowl, the mother tincture, and the flowers are only staying in, for England, it was 4 hours. Here in Australia, it's about 2 hours. The vibration is left, the flowers discarded, that water is added to brandy, and that's your mother tincture. Now, 7 drops are taken from the mother tincture into up to a 30 ml bottle of brandy and water, and that becomes the stock bottle. So if a practitioner or someone at home wanted to use the remedies a lot, they would buy stock essence. And then they would make a dose bottle, which is the next dilution, where you take 7 drops of that, add it to another brandy water up to 30 ml. And so we're not going past that dose bottle. So there's only really the 2 dilutions. And if you dilute it again, it doesn't seem to work very well. So it's quite different to homeopathy.
Yeah.
The more you're diluting, the stronger, deeper acting it is, and less physical, and having all the emotional components, etc. And Richard Gerber, an American doctor, he's published a lovely book on vibrational medicine, which is that title. And he took some research by a man called Garudis. And Garudis' understanding of how the flower essence is working, that when you take it, it goes under your tongue, into the bloodstream, into the digestive nervous system. Then it goes to your meridians. Now, which is where the acupuncturist would stick all the needles in. Now, we have silica in our body, our connective tissue, hair, nails. And the silica is an amplifier. So it amplifies that vibrational quality of the essence out through the portals and the meridians, goes out into our subtle bodies, and then works its way back. So if you're working on an emotional issue, let's say there's jealousy, there's a remedy, Mountain Devil works on that, but you probably only need to take it for 2 weeks. But if you've been jealous for a very long time, what's in your outer subtle bodies, which the jealousy is, those emotional states stay there. But if you've had it for a very long time, it starts retracting inwards and has an impact on the physical body. So jealousy will affect gallbladder, that rage, anger, hatred. So if you've got a gallbladder problem, you're going to need Mountain Devil for more than the 2 weeks, because it's indicative that you've had the problem, that emotional imbalance, for quite some time. And a lovely example for that was Kevin Rudd. After the party took the leadership of him as the Prime Minister, and there's photos of him in the back bench sitting there just fuming days after that event. And then he had his gallbladder removed.
Oh, interesting.
Another couple of days later, you could see this rage just stemming from him. And he had a reputation for being quite an angry character. So there's probably a lot of that around, and that was the tipping point. Ancient traditional cultures, Ayurvedic, Chinese medicine, observing people for thousands of years, said that 90% of our physical symptoms stem from those emotional imbalances. And that's where I think it's great flower essence, because you don't have to be trained in medicine or anatomy, physiology. But if your child's been not invited to the birthday party all the other friends have, or it's easy to recognize those emotional states, or maybe it's sadness, that like the pet dog has died and the child's really quite upset. And if you stay in that sadness and don't release it, it'll affect your lungs. So on a little bit here, but to tie it in, we've been donating the essences to orphanages in Brazil for probably close to 20 years now. And when we started doing our work, the children were getting sometimes 6-7 cases of bronchitis a year. getting a lot of antibiotics, which was not good for them. It was costly for the government. And then after we'd been working with the flower essences in the orphanages for about a year, the incidence of bronchitis was less than 1 case per child per year. And of course, it means that they're not holding on to all that grief and sadness that the parents didn't want them or are dead or couldn't look after them. And also health-wise, physically, they're a lot better from that as well. And I think that's the beauty. You could just recognize when someone's sad and give the remedy. And that's why families can use them. My goal is for every family to have the essences so the children can get brought up with them when they're dealing with learning problems or being bullied or sibling rivalry, whatever it is. There's essences that can quickly nip it in the bud and bring about better quality for the child. And when I was at my studying homeopathy, probably the best homeopath in our class, he was given 3 doses of Thuya 200. The homeopaths will love this one. Took 2 doses, felt great. He said, oh, it's only 1 more dose. And took his 3rd dose and aggravated, and he was aggravating for 6 months. And even the best homeopaths in Sydney couldn't stop that aggravation. That's the beauty of the bush essences, is there's a self-adjusting mechanism. And look, I love homeopathy. I just got whacked on the shoulder by a surfboard a couple of days ago and wasn't sure if it was broken. So I'm hitting eupatorium, the bone's all bruised, and I've got arnica, and I've got some hypericum. Like, you need to be well trained in homeopathy to understand like aggravations and things like that, where the bush essences, there's a built-in self-adjusting mechanism. The bush essence remedy will take you to the point where you're able to deal with it. It won't push you into an aggravation, for example. So there's differences in that way. And so it's a pretty standard dose, 7 drops morning and night, 2 weeks if it's more acute. If it's more ongoing, we go for a month and then reassess.
Ian, you're such an amazing speaker. I can just sit here, and if I don't say a word for the rest of the interview, I would be quite happy, because your knowledge is just so profound. And you can see that even after all these years, you're still so passionate about what you do. And it's always really inspiring when you get to speak to somebody who's still so passionate about what it is that they're doing. And you can see that it's inspiring you all through. I have a lot of questions for you just from unpacking some of the things that you've said. But it's interesting that you said about Edward Bach and how he did the bowel nosodes first before he did the flowers. Not many people know that, but some of our best work about the bowel nosodes, which remedies made from poo, I'll call them homeopathic probiotics. They're not, but that's the best way to describe it. And then
I like that one.
And then after that, he went to flowers. So yeah, not many people will know that Edward Bach started off working with poo and then worked with flowers. I think that's quite funny.
His comment at the time was, I'm sure nature has got a better solution than fucking around with poo.
You can imagine it would be depressing, like working in that laboratory, because he was actually analyzing the stool and then the remedies came from that. And you said about the 7 drops. So I've got a few questions from what you were unpacking, but why 7? I know 7 is quite a big thing for you in the dosage and administration, but what's the significance for you of that?
In that early information, I kept getting the message to use 7 drops. And say for Bach flowers, for example, it's traditionally you'd use 4 drops from the stock bottle to make your dose bottle. But then they take it 4 times a day, whereas the bush essences just on rising and retiring is a very standard dose. And I experiment because as well as the single remedies I've mentioned, such as the bush iris or the mountain devil, there's 69 single remedies, individual ones. And from those, we've combined a number together to create combinations. And there's one called travel essence. So, for example, if you go flying back to South Africa to visit friends and family, if you take 7 drops of the travel essence every hour while you're awake on the plane, it really minimizes your jet lag. And we had one of our teachers used to be a pilot for Ansett, and they got her to do an assessment of the stresses for cabin and crew and also stewards. And there were so many different factors. We made up the travel essence. It's got 14 remedies in it. Most of them have about 5, but there are so many different stresses, whether you're flying east, west, north, south, gamma radiation, dehydration, etc., etc. So putting 14, that's 98 drops of stock we got to put into each bottle of the travel essence, which really depletes your quantity. Have to make a lot more. So I experimented with 3 and 4 drops, but I kept getting 7 was so much better. And I also studied numerology at the time that I studied my naturopathy. And every patient I ever treat, I always do their numerology chart. And 7 is the highest number on the physical plane, and it's the learning of lessons. I find it appropriate. Look at 7, there's probably more symbology of 7 than any other number. It's a number of love, number of God in some cultures. If we look in nature, there are 7 cycles or stages from when water falls as rain to when it becomes a river. The length of a leaf in ratio to the height of a tree is in a ratio of 7. We have 7 deadly sins. We have 7 virtues. I think one of our newsletters, we ask people, what do you associate with 7? What are some of the significance? It's a whole newsletter on the number 7.
And it's something to do with your age.
They've got something interesting, please send it into Eugenia and I.
And I think that I know it because my kiddies go to a Steiner school, like every 7 years of your human development. Yeah. It's a new kind of phase of life as well. So,
which is why they have a big celebration at 21, because each 7 years, one of your subtle bodies forms. So if you can have 3 of your subtle bodies fully formed, you have a very good chance to overcoming illnesses or infections, etc. And we just see it's an excuse for a party now. And like at age 7, if children had a good solid upbringing, then they suddenly branch out that they're quite happy doing sleepovers. If they've had that good, secure family base, then they can feel they can go out into the world a little bit more. Yeah.
Now, I haven't said this in the interview yet. I was going to put it in the intro, but Ian and I actually had the most incredible interview a couple of months ago and I lost it. And anyone who's in my homeopathic Facebook group for this podcast will know about that. I lost 10 episodes. Ian was one of them. So I so appreciate redoing it. But in our first interview, you mentioned something about the numerology that I was hoping we could kind of revisit. And it was to do with children that are born in this age and how you mentioned something about communication and how their numerology is a little bit different. I can't remember quite what you said, but do you recall me talking about that? Mm-hmm. Can you mention that again?
Yeah. So when we entered into this millennium, for the very first time for like 1,000 years, we're having children born with no 1 in their birth date. We're all born in the 1900s, so we've got at least 1. If you've only got a single 1 in your birth date, there can be more difficulty talking about your feelings to someone else. You can be articulate, you can talk about politics and a particular topic, but when it comes how you're feeling, it's like, oh, it's really awkward. And they probably think, oh, especially people close to you, oh, they know how I'm feeling, because they don't until you tell them. So the flannel flower is wonderful remedy to helping you communicate and expressing feelings. But now in this millennium, we've had children born with no 1 in their birth date. And that's where it's nice if you get the children, you can change some of those patterns or potential and bring in more positive ones. The other thing with these children is that everyone has got at least 1, 2 in the birth date. And 2 represents sensitivity and cooperation, working with others, but very much that sensitivity.
Oh, wow.
And in an ideal world, my numerology teacher said a man would have 2 2s and a woman would have 1 2. And females were given an extra 2 by default from that whole. Has 2 2s, it's equivalent of 3. And for a man having 3 or a woman having 2 or more, it's like overly sensitive. In the health food store, you get someone pouring out all their problems. Energetically, it leaves the residue. Someone with lots of 2s will be very sensitive. They pick up that straight away. Let's say they were in a restaurant, say, and someone's very sad. They would start feeling sad. And they've got to know, is it my sadness or someone else's? And like psychic sponges. Sometimes they might be massaging someone's shoulders, and if the person's got a sore shoulder, they'll get that sore shoulder. They're very easy. They just pick it up. So there's a flower called fringed violet, Physanitis tuberosus, and it's it's purple, 3 petals, very strong spiritual aspect, but it's got hair-like projections, hence the fringe, and it's great for sealing the aura and protecting it, making sure you're not just this sponge picking up every person's feelings and emotions. Or let's say there's been an argument or something in a house, like there's, mightn't feel very good. You go to a hotel room and maybe someone's a huge row, or maybe they died there. So energetically, they'll feel really, oh, this is horrible in here. So the fringe violet's a nice one for these people to feel far more protected, not picking up too much. And if we look at some of the birth dates we had last year, 22nd of the 2nd 2022. I mean, just like how sensitive with that person. They need an intravenous drip of fringe violet. And we're seeing patterns that, like no numbers potentially on the mental plane, for example, no numbers on the physical plane, which is 1, 4, and 7 with these young children. And that's where I teach a 2-day numerology course, and we talk about them and then say, oh, well, this, if you have this, no numbers on the physical plane, then Sundew, Drosera would be very good. And of course, the homeopaths would know Drosera as being the remedy for whooping cough, for example. But as a flower essence, it's being very grounded and attention to detail, very, rather than the child's is very vague and dreamy and not very practical, for example.
Interesting that you say grounded, because the flower itself is very close to the ground. It's quite
well. The petals are, but the actual flower, the stem, sometimes can be like 30 centimeters or more from the ground, and it's the smallest of all the flowers is hovering in the breeze, and that's the doctrine of signatures for the Sundew. And when I make it, I've got to get enough flowers of these tiny little flower to fill the bowl, and I need to use some part of the same plant. I can't bring in something from another genus or species because it's going to be contamination. So I've got to make like a little lasso of this little tight knot around it, and if I pull too quickly or hard, the flower shoots up in the air. Just enough, and then you've got to feel enough for bulbs. And by lunchtime, by about midday, the flowers start closing down. So you've got to be so focused in your attention to detail, which is all part of what Sundew is about.
It's interesting, Ian. I say this often to my staff, but some of the things we have to do when we run a business, like our clients will never know the things that we go through to make beautiful products for them. And they shouldn't know, they should just enjoy them. But it's interesting hearing you talk about these little bits of things that you have to do to actually produce this.
And that's one of the nice things about my work is I get to go out into the bush in beautiful parts of the country, in wilderness areas, to research flowers and do the work on them.
I'm so grateful that you mentioned that, Ian, because all I see in my clinic all day long are people say, Eugenie, I'm so sensitive. I'm sensitive to everything. I'm sensitive to everything. Yeah. So, and all these children that are just picking up all these emotions from everyone else. And so the classroom environment is simply too much for them because they're picking up all the issues of everybody else in their class. So grateful you mentioned about the fringed violet. Is that something that you could potentially put in the child's water bottle and send them to school with? And would you maybe do that? If it's like an ongoing thing, could you maybe do that like once a week or something like that? Or what would you do?
Yeah, look, one's dealing with electromagnetic radiation, but this one here is what we call it the angel pendant, and it's got fringe violet and angel sword. So if, for example, your aura was open, and that could be an injury has done it, losing consciousness, getting anesthetic, for example. It could be getting whacked in the head from a hockey stick and unconscious, magic mushrooms, hallucinogenic things, too much marijuana, all those things, getting blind, drunk, can all open up the aura. So your energy goes out, but also other energies can more readily come in. So fringe violet sealing the aura, but angel sword gets rid of any energies which have come in which are not so good. So those two work very well together, and we put them both in the meditation essence, the space clearing spray that you've mentioned, and also in the emergency essence as well. But if you've got very sensitive ones, we do a round pendant for children, and they can just wear it stock strength right next to them. So that's a nice ongoing one. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. And when you said that, I just had this strong image in my mind to say birth trauma. I have so many women that have extreme birth trauma where they feel that they've left their bodies because of the intensity of it, or there's a C-section or something that they weren't planned for, or lots of medication or anything like that. So that would be a really great thing to maybe even give a newborn baby if you feel that they've left their body and haven't been able to come back.
Oh, absolutely. And that term floppy baby, sometimes they're born, they're just not fully come in. So Sundew is a great one for that. Also, babies will often cry in that first week at the same time that they were born, and they're fed, they've got a dry nappy, and what it is, they're processing the birth experience. And fringe violet's a really nice one to help process any trauma they've had from there. Also, that anterior fontanelle in the baby's soft spot, which is open for about 6 weeks energetically. And some cultures don't put the child on the ground for that first 6 weeks, or don't take them out of the house because they're so sensitive picking up, and especially this lot of children too. And you can just close the anterior fontanelle off with a little bit of fringe violet, making a cross over that anterior fontanelle as well. And you've mentioned cesareans, and like South America, Brazil, places like that, 90% of the births are cesarean. It's just like staggering. Here we always have concern when it gets over 30%. And the other thing is, if a woman's had a cesarean, that incision is going to cut through 5 of the 14 meridians in the body. And what will happen is, quite often, the energy won't flow effectively along that meridian after an incision that's deep enough to require stitches. So there's a remedy called slender rice flour, and it reactivates all the meridians. So if there's been scars, it'll allow the meridian to flow effectively along there. When I stopped seeing patients full time, I started doing workshops on all the modalities I use a lot, like the numerology, and also kinesiology was another one. And we demonstrate that and show people. And in my workshops, I love kinesiology because you can demonstrate and say, rather than say, it clears blocks in the scars, we bring people up on stage and we do kinesiology testing along the length of the scar, and we can show that it's, the before and after. Just straight away, slender rice flour will make a huge shift and change in that.
Mm-hmm. Ian, I've got literally like a gazillion more questions for you. And I know last time we spoke about colors and things like that as well. So we're going to have to get you back for round 2. But just a final question. Why do you think the Australian bush flower essences are really important? Why and how are they different to the standard flower essences, the bark flower essences? And why do you think in this day and age that they're really important? Sorry, that's a really big question. But
yeah. Look, some people think, there's only the 38 bark flowers. They're the only flowers have healing quality. Every flower has a healing quality. Some express it more fully than others. And I think in Australia, we're quite unique here that we had the first flowering plants. That's accepted because we had the first erosion, we had the first soil. Also, we have the highest number of flowering plants in the world. And when we had all the continents separating, so Africa, Australia, Antarctica, South America were all joined together, that gone wonderland. And Australia was about 30 million years ago, was the last one to separate from Antarctica. So what happened is Australia as an island grew up in that isolation, and the flora that we had stayed quite unique to that. There was no invading species that took over, for example. And I know when I show the flowers in the workshops overseas, people are struck by there's a sense of ancientness in the flowers. And also, we have a predominance of red and purple. And red is that energy, vitality, and purple is that deep spiritual one. And certainly the bush essences have got a reputation for being incredibly quick acting. You use it for 2, not a month, for example. And I think it's all those features. And we didn't have huge major wars. We're starting to realize there were a lot of wars going on with Indigenous people, but compared to the landmass, it was quite small, and the numbers were not like teaching in Europe some places. And like a few kilometers up the road from the workshop, he had tens of thousands of people killed violently in the last century. So there's still a pristine environment from where the flowers come from. There's not that pollution from electromagnetic and other things. So all of these things come through in the essences. And there's some unique features, like one flower called mulla mulla. It's dealing with radiation now, whether it's solar, electromagnetic, and here we've got 5G starting to come, but it's also gamma radiation when you're flying in a plane 30,000 feet above the ground. And we had Green Cross do a whole lot of research. They were like an offshoot of Red Cross, but more environmental, with Chernobyl. So they would go to Belarus, which is the worst affected country from that disaster, monitoring children, even children born many years after Chernobyl, which was 86. And to find the highest levels of radiation, they would give the combination with the mulla mulla called electro to them. And in 2 weeks, they reduced the nuclear radiation by 42%, and was the most effective treatment they'd ever come across. And this was run by cardiologists, neurologists, and what have you. So like this amazing plant coming here in Australia, and there's not an equivalent like it that we know of at this point in time anywhere else. So there's some very unique, powerful ones here. Like we mentioned Boab, being able to work on the miasms as well. Sturt desert pea, floral emblem of South Australia, such a powerful flower, dealing with deep grief and sadness. And we're all carrying some sadness to some degree. So I think Australia is just very unique in the flora coming through, and certainly using me as that messenger, giving me that information so we could get these flowers out and being used. And the fact that they're safe, there's no side effects. It's just this wonderful modality to people. And you can be a homeopath and you can work with the flower essences together. It's not like, oh, they're separate. I'm a homeopath. I can't use them. And I know that you've had a good friend of mine, Ian, on the program before, and he set up the Lakeland College in England. In fact, he was in a homeopathic book. It's like a new age bookshop in London. He told me the story that this is Ian Watson I'm talking about, and that my book fell off the shelf and hit him on the head. And he's like, oh, I'm obviously got to read this book. And then Ian got me started using the essences there in the college, and part of the curriculum, they got me up there to teach. So I'd be running the workshop there and we'd have 100 homeopaths. And I said to them, like, because some homeopaths say, oh, well, if you give a bush essence, you'll affect the pattern. You won't be able to tell what the homeopathic remedy is doing, what the bush essence is doing. And I put that to them. I was great. I've got 100 homeopaths I'm going to ask you. And their conclusion was, if you're a homeopath, you can't tell the difference. You're not a very good homeopath.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And speaking of courses, Ian, you have some courses coming up, because I know people are going to go wild over this episode, because if this is new to them, it's life-changing information, really. Because whether you're a home user or a practitioner, you can incorporate this in your practice in clinic or at home. And you have some courses coming up here in Australia. I'm very sad that it's not going to be in Perth this year. Not so happy about that. But talk to us about... I'll
come later in the year, because I've got to replenish macrocarpa. So.
Okay, wonderful.
The second half. Yeah.
So talk to us about the courses that you've got coming up. And I mean, people can go to your website, find out more about it there. But you have got some coming up, I think, in February, March as well.
Yeah. So personally, I'm going to be teaching... We have the bush essences. We also have 3 spiritual ranges of remedies as well. And I'm going to be teaching the first range, which is called White Light Essences. I'll be teaching that in Sydney and Melbourne. It's a 2-day workshop. We take the remedies, we all meditate on them. I talk about their qualities. And because we've got a large group of people all taking the remedies, a very powerful energy allows you to experience them, even though it might be the first time you've taken it, very powerfully. So we'll be going through all the 7 remedies of that range in that workshop. So very experiential and quite a wonderful one. We also have teachers all around Australia, and we'll be running our level 1 workshops. We'll be in Perth, Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. And if you're wanting to learn about the essences, if you go to our website, with COVID and all the shutdown, we built a recording studio in our offices, and I recorded all my workshops so they're available online if people want to do it that way. And except for the kinesiology, where you need to be hands-on and I'll test to make sure you're testing the right way. But all the others are available online. And if you want to do the live ones, we've got level 1s coming up, my White Light Essence workshops. So yeah, look, it'd be fantastic if you turn up to one of the workshops, say, look, I learned about you from Eugenie, and that'd be really nice to hear that feedback from you.
That'd be amazing. Ian, thank you so much for your time again. I really appreciate it. And I really hope I can have you back on the show again to just share more of your wisdom, because I know there were some other things that we talked about last time that we couldn't cover today, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eugenie.